Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Alka. It's very exciting to have a sociologist here, a young and enthusiastic sociologist who works in such an interesting area. As I mentioned to her beforehand, this is an area that causes me a lot of personal trauma, so I'm excited to hear a scholarly approach to this. Alka Menon is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale, where she's also a research fellow at the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. Her research examines the effects of globalization and medical consumerism on physician authority and healthcare. She's currently working on a book on cosmetic surgery in transnational perspective, focusing on the multi-ethnic cases of US and Malaysia. Her work has been published in a number of scholarly journals, including Ethnic and Racial Studies, Social Science and Medicine, and Poetics. Alka Menon received her Ph.D. in sociology from Northwestern just a year or two ago, and she's extraordinarily accomplished. It's amazing to have you here. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I look forward to your questions about cosmetic surgery in the US in the Q&A. This is a part of the overall research project, but today I want to share cosmetic surgery in more of an Asian perspective, using my research in Malaysia and the sort of international level and the perspective of healthcare providers. So we might know cosmetic surgery from the point of view of celebrity culture in the US especially, but my research really examines how healthcare practitioners decide what is appropriate and not appropriate for patients to do, and thinks about cosmetic surgery in the context of medicine. So in the pages of journals and textbooks, cosmetic surgeons specify several kinds of patients, beauty ideals, and techniques to achieve those ideals on the basis of race. Here are some examples of racial standards for nose jobs or rhinoplasties. You see non-Caucasian, Asian American, African American, mestizo, Indian American. There's a whole gamut of labels here that you can imagine some people might identify with and other people might resent. And these kinds of racial specific guidelines existed for other facial procedures as well. These are articles published by plastic surgeons in journals for other plastic surgeons, but sometimes patients come across them and bring them in to a consultation with a doctor. So why label things in this kind of a way? Asserting expertise on race on the basis of race is a way to make connections to patients, which is particularly important in cosmetic surgery. Now, when I'm talking about cosmetic surgery, I'm referring to a set of elective procedures that patients undergo to improve their appearance, enhance their overall look. These are not medically necessary for survival. It does not restore function after an accident. This is for already healthy patients, something to improve upon that base status. So there's not a guaranteed supply or a guaranteed set of patients, right? Doctors have to convince patients that they have a solution to a problem that the patient has in order to have continuous service. So cosmetic surgeons really want to build relationships with patients and building rapport, not just with the individuals who come before them, but in such a way that patients would recommend their friends and their family members to come and to return over time. Patients are paying out of pocket for these modifications. They're mostly not covered by insurance, although we can talk about exceptions to that line. So surgeons have to appeal to patients in terms that matter to them and that are clearly and widely recognizable. And you can think that race and ethnicity might be one way to do that. So I was interested in the extent to which cosmetic surgeons in practice standardize the use of, in particular, categories of race and ethnicity like this. And so after analyzing the content of journal articles like this, I turned to interviewing and talking to surgeons themselves. And so in my larger research project, the book that Emily alluded to at the beginning, I asked how and why do cosmetic surgeons use racial categories in their practices? And specifically in the talk today, I'm going to talk about how they define the racial category Asian. And instead of starting from a familiar, maybe more familiar context to people in the room, I'm going to take you far away to Malaysia. So to answer these questions, I conducted a study of cosmetic surgery rooted mostly in the US and Malaysia, but I went to Japan, I went to Singapore, I've been all over the US at these conferences for plastic surgeons. So pinning down one place It's a practice that happens in many different places, and that altogether informs what surgeons think is normal. So to preview my findings here, cosmetic surgeons in the US, Malaysia, and other countries use racial terms like the category Asian as a form of partial standardization. So it allows them to talk in the same terms across these very different kinds of contexts, but the precise definition of what they mean by Asian might be a little bit different. I'm going to show you examples of what I mean by that. And so this ambiguity, you could think, would be really confusing. Usually in science and medicine, people want to have terms that mean the same thing, that is very carefully circumscribed. But here, this ambiguity with respect to race is productive, and it allows actually surgeons from Brazil and Japan to talk to one another at these international meetings. So a category like Asian has different meanings at different scales. Okay, so I'm going to, in what remains of the talk, say a little bit more about race and standards and ambiguity, and then turn to what I saw at transnational plastic surgery conferences, and then my interviews with Malaysian surgeons before getting to some final thoughts about why I think this matters beyond plastic surgery. So medical sociologists have characterized the practice of modern medicine as a marriage of science and art. You can see this from the picture here, which a surgeon came up with. And they see this as characterized by a tension between two modes of reasoning: evidence-based standards and clinical judgment. So sociologists have chronicled how science has been brought to bear in what was considered the art of medicine, by which they mean patient care decisions. On the one hand, modern medicine offers universal, homogenous, standardized approaches to patient care, often under the rubric of a movement called evidence-based medicine. But on the other hand, modern medicine continues to rely on clinical judgment, which is made up of surgeons' practical, concrete clinical experience, which is biased by its own particularistic perspective. It depends on which patients walk in the door over the course of your career. That shapes your common sense for how to interact with and operate on patients. So as the sort of tide towards standardization has taken off in the US, you can find evidence-based guidelines for all sorts of procedures or conditions, and there more and more are being introduced all the time. Sociologists are really focused on that, on increasing standardization and what consequences that has for patient care. But I'm interested in clinical judgment, how it is that surgeons' experience over time shapes how they interact with patients, and how the particular biographies of people can be important there. So I've sort of put out this opposition between evidence-based medicine and standards on the one hand and clinical judgment on the other, but I think there's an in-between. In practice, those two go hand in hand. You don't just apply the standard to just anybody. You have to decide when to apply an evidence-based standard. And it's not that universal, standardized, one-size-fits-all medicine and personalized individual medicine are the only options. Most people are not going into the clinic and getting a swab of their DNA tested before they're given treatment for the flu. In practice, physicians rely on categorical groups, such as race or gender, or another set of groupings along lines of age, for purposes of generating or applying clinical knowledge, which has been called niche standardization. And so these niche categories, race, gender, or age, are already salient to social life and are imported into the medical domain, which you can think about having consequences for how we think about those social identities in turn. It's a sort of cyclical process. Now, I want to take a very brief moment to define what I mean by standards. I'm using the definition of standards as agreed upon rules constructed to achieve uniformities across time and space. Race is not quite standardized in medical practice in any field in the US. Racial classification schemes are diffuse, ambiguous, and contradictory within research and the clinic setting. There's one or two things that you might see from the US Census if you're in the US, but you go to the UK and it looks very different. While race is often linked to physical features, it also incorporates cultural competence and associations. Ambiguous definitions for race, or a lack altogether of definitions, continues to characterize medicine. So there's two ways we can think about race in cosmetic surgery. One is to see racial standards as formalizing and streamlining geared towards transparency and reproducibility. But another way you could think about it is to see race clearly as not clearly and consistently defined, as maintaining ambiguity. This idea comes out of genomics and genetics, where as there's been more and more crunching about human difference, more and more categories proliferate. The idea being that the study populations who participate in these studies want to see their groupings presented in the research too. They want to be able to see themselves in the data, even as doctors and researchers want to make generalizations. So there's a tension there. And this fuzziness about definition of terms and this maintaining of ambiguity allows scientists and doctors to maintain collaborations with colleagues as well as communities under study. So I think you see a little bit more of this ambiguity and fuzziness being emphasized in cosmetic surgery, and that's behind the use of race. So the use of racial categories across different sites internationally in plastic surgery is standardized, but not the content of the categories, which leads to some ambiguity. Developing expertise by race allows surgeons to assert their authority on the basis of their clinical judgment. The particularities of race vary so much across contexts that the enshrining of the use of race in cosmetic surgery ensures that surgeons can differentiate themselves from one another by saying, hey, here's what my experience is, this is what I think is beautiful and racially appropriate, and that people will vary across, with similar biographies might have different outcomes on that measure. Okie dokie, so as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on Malaysia today in my research findings. So Malaysia is a tropical Southeast Asian country and former British colony of about 30 million people. It's circled here. Sometimes I show a map that puts the US and Malaysia together. They're about as far away as possible on the maps that we are used to seeing. That really emphasizes the distance when you're doing research in two places that are that far apart. It takes well over a day to get from here to there. Malaysia has positioned itself as a medical tourist destination, not just for plastic surgery, but for other kinds of procedures that can be scheduled ahead of time, like heart surgery. And they are trying to attract patients from China, from India, from the Middle East, as well as from Australia and New Zealand, which are to the bottom of this map, not pictured here. Now, when I think of Malaysia, when you think of Malaysian cosmetic surgery, I want you to have this image in your head. The Petronas Towers were, when they were built in the late 90s, the tallest buildings of the world. They were shiny, modern, gleaming. Plastic surgery in Malaysia looks a lot like plastic surgery does in the US. It uses the same kinds of materials. The sort of clinic is a similar setup. Some of the training materials are the same. So it's part of this more global practice there. Malaysia, the interesting thing about Malaysia is that it portrays itself very self-consciously as Asia in miniature. So this is a screenshot of Malaysia's tourism website. And I don't know if everyone can read it, but the second paragraph says, there's only one place where all the colors, flavors, sounds, and sights of Asia come together. No other country has Asia's three major races, Malays, Chinese, and Indian, as well as various other ethnic groups, they say. So I selected Malaysia because of this claim for diversity and because they said surgeons are drawn from this, and they have this experience across difference of interacting with different Asian ethnic groups. As a country that also treats patients from all over the world because of medical tourism, it also provides a concrete and explicit perspective on whiteness, which is something that US surgeons couldn't always articulate in the same way. Now, the specific demographics of the Asian ethnic groups in Malaysia are listed here on this graph. Ethnic Malays are the largest group at about 67% of the population. As a category, this is interested, they're specified by the Constitution. It's a legal category, but it's also a religious category. Statutorily, Malays are Muslim in Malaysia. Ethnic Chinese make up about 25% of the population, and Indians make up about 7% of the population. So because of this larger Muslim presence, Malaysia markets itself as a leader in Islamic products and services. All right, so as I said, I started with the analysis of the articles that I listed at the beginning for different kinds of nose jobs, and I'm happy to talk about the specifics of all these other things, the methods that I followed, but I want to highlight the interviews with cosmetic surgeons, which I'm going to draw from, as well as the observations of surgeons talking to each other at these international conferences, and the observations of surgeons talking to their patients in the clinic in Malaysia. So what does the racial category Asian look like in cosmetic surgery practice in Asia? At the global level of international meetings and journal articles, one might expect surgeons to have used race to refer to physical difference as a lingua franca across patient populations and cultural contexts. After all, cosmetic surgery is about changing the body. It's the definition of superficial, right? However, cosmetic surgeons double down on their assertions of expertise on the cultural aspects of race. So what do I mean by that? This is a picture from one of the conferences, sorry it's a little blurry, that a surgeon put to his audience. So at the International Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgery meeting in Kyoto in 2016, Dr. De La Vega, a plastic surgeon from Mexico, juxtaposed photographs of two women and asked the assembled audience to identify which one was from Mexico and which one was from Asia. He had people raise their hands. Then he advanced to a second slide featuring two more ethnically ambiguous photographs of men. The nationality associated with each of the photographs was counterintuitive. The patients who had what seemed to be typical Asian features hailed from Mexico, and those with more mestizo features, their terms, the reverse. He emphasized physical similarities between the Asian and the Latin patient, enumerating specific facial features about the nose, such as low radic, short bones, low projection, and soft cartilage. So saying, hey, these are pretty similar, we can learn from each other. And he goes through his clinical cases and gives his techniques for modifying this nose. However, he ended his presentation with a last picture slide of African masks saying, every culture has its own concept of beauty. With the juxtaposition, the putting together of photographs of Latin and Asian patients, Dr. De La Vega acknowledged the tenuousness of racial categories before ultimately reinforcing differences between those categories. So he says, we're really just the same. If you look at the physical features, all the same, but culturally we're so different. So he's, despite these sort of claims and gestures to universality, his conclusion implied that the same racial categories were still useful and meaningfully distinct in terms of denoting cultural difference. Those cultural differences were on full display throughout the International Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgery meeting in Kyoto, as surgeons attempted to explain their cultural context and their clinical cases to their peers. So I observed a panel titled Asian Rhinoplasty, or Asian Nose Jobs there, and the surgeons presenting were from Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, China, and Japan. Each of the surgeons discussed different techniques for the implantation of synthetic nasal implants made of silicone and Gore-Tex. So this is what goes into the nose if you're trying to make it bigger. And surgeons would talk about the techniques that they use to carve these implants and insert them into the nose. This is medical grade silicone. Cosmetic surgeons in the US and Malaysia had informed me before I went to this meeting that they had very different approaches to nose jobs. They said this was going to be very controversial. Asian cosmetic surgeons preferred the implantation of synthetic materials like this, silicone-based stuff, to augment the nose, whereas Western cosmetic surgeons preferred using natural materials like cartilage from elsewhere in the body, typically taken from the rib or the ear, if not somewhere in the nose. So in the Q&A session after the panel on Asian nose jobs, a Belgian surgeon in the audience stood up, looked around, says, am I the only non-Asian here? All right, let's see. So he challenged the use of synthetic rather than natural implants for nose jobs. The presenter who had spoken last was from the Philippines, Dr. Gaëtan, and he asserted that synthetic implants were cheaper to insert. They would cost only hundreds rather than thousands of dollars, safer. They didn't require general anesthesia or an additional surgical site in the rib or the ear to take out material. And safer. They didn't require general anesthesia. They were well tolerated by patients. The Belgian surgeon immediately responded, what about the risks of infection? Synthetic implants, who knows what's been on top of them. They went back and forth like this for a while. The Filipino surgeon turned to the panel being like, what's this guy asking? Am I missing something? How is this subject to so much debate? Finally, they agreed to disagree, noting that the cultural common sense varied across locations. The Filipino surgeon observed that the Western cosmetic surgeon's squeamishness about the use of synthetic material in the nose reflected their own cultural attitudes towards bodily modification. And as he pointed out, surgeons in the US had no reservations about using synthetic implants in the breast. Asian cosmetic surgeons' preference for less invasive procedures in the nose required use of synthetic material. You have to get the material to add to the nose from somewhere. And so a synthetic site allows less invasive surgery. So at this global level of conferences, cosmetic surgeons linked their own preferences for some kinds of materials and procedures to cultural differences that they called, that they marked as Asian. And this staved off a more universal attempt at standardization. Everybody on that panel could get behind this label. Now, oh, sorry, that didn't get put there. You also saw a way of describing an Asian aesthetic as distinct from a Western aesthetic at this sort of global stage. So at the meetings, surgeons would often have pictures, not just of their patients, but more generic images of what they thought were instructive of their aesthetic sense or philosophy or of beauty. And so this kind of an image from ancient Chinese or Japanese and sometimes Korean art, they would put on their presentations to say, this is an alternate genealogy for Asian beauty. People have wanted different kinds of looks for some time. So they specifically talked about certain traditions of face reading or physiognomy, citing Japanese, Korean, and Chinese traditions to explain preferences for certain face shapes and the prominence of eyes and noses. Whereas Western surgeons would say this is all about patients in Asia wanting to look more Western or whiter. So this attempt to trace a historical lineage for aesthetics within Asia, this using of the ancient Chinese princess in these presentations, speaks to the motivations of cosmetic surgeons in Asia to build a separate area of marketable expertise. Why go all the way to Asia for medical tourism to get this procedure? Yes, it's cheaper, that's the main reason people do these things, but also they were saying, we do beauty in a totally different way and have for thousands of years. Here's evidence of that. So this is similar in some ways to efforts to develop Asian genomics or Asian biotechnology, these sort of different kinds of science or clinical medicine, but they're trying to trace it backwards in time to a greater degree in this discussion of aesthetics. Okay, so let's turn to Malaysia, a more specific Asian context. We saw that at the global level, surgeons emphasize Asian difference in sociocultural terms, talking about differences culturally rather than biologically. In Malaysia, you see some similar things at work, but different kinds of precise definitions for what might be Asian. So in Malaysia, let me go back for a sec. The category Asian had more content associated with it and expanded to encompass considerable diversity. As I showed at the beginning, the Asians in Malaysia included Chinese, Indian, as well as Malays, and that's just for folks who were citizens. But the category Asian also contracted, became smaller for easy comparison with other possibilities. Religious difference, for example, could be flattened into the general term conservative. Asian more narrowly referred, they would use it as shorthand for Chinese and Malay patients, and invariably Asian could be the opposite of two possibilities here, not just Asian versus Western or Asian versus Caucasian, but Asian versus Indian became the sort of axis that was relevant for Malaysian cosmetic surgeons. So Dr. Huang is one of the plastic surgeons in Malaysia who I followed around in the clinic. So I interviewed her, but I also spent about a month with her, and I was sitting in the office with her as she treated different kinds of patients. She was fairly young, she was in her 40s, had just finished training and been in practice for about 5 years, and she just talked continuously. So she was explaining to me what was happening as it was going on. So she had seen several patients this day, and she was giving me a sort of summary at the end of the day, and she told me, if you compare an Indian girl to a Chinese girl, they are completely different. It's almost as good as comparing a Chinese girl with a Caucasian girl, like that. The unique features, I would say, are basically Asian Chinese or Oriental ethnic, because they are the most difficult people to treat in terms of eyelid surgery, recovery, and bruising and all that. Ugh, they are horrible. I know, because when I was operating on Caucasian patients in the States, oh my God, their skin was so thin and it's just so easy to do. They heal so fast, within a few days. But the Asians, they bruise like crazy. So there's a lot going on in this quote. First, she sets up that different possibilities of others, right? There's comparing Chinese to a Caucasian versus an Indian, right? They're so different. Then she talks about the unique challenges of operating on Asian, Chinese, or Oriental ethnic patients. Those are her words for differentiating them. And what she's sort of suggesting is you need special and different skills to be able to do this, and that she's mastered them, and so that she can do it, but that it's not such an easy thing to do. So she proceeded to tell me when differentiating between kinds of aesthetics that there were multiple things at play here. So she didn't have a picture of the ancient Chinese princess of the sort that I showed a few slides ago up in her office, but she did think about different ideals that patients might be looking for and apply the Asian racial label to it. So how many of you have heard of the Asian eyelid surgery, out of curiosity? Okay, handful of people. So that surgery is increasing this lid height to make it look bigger and to create a fold. About 50% of people in East Asia are born naturally with this fold, but it's a popular procedure that the folks who don't have that fold often will go seek, and it's something that both men and women look for. So Dr. Huang was telling me how far to go, what is a good intervention with the Asian eyelid surgery. She said, if you want the crease to be like 10 millimeters, that's more Caucasian, and fine, I'll do it for you. But I'll warn you first that you'll look a little bit different, a little bit odd. In terms of the lid crease height for Asian, very natural is about 6 millimeters. Just the distance between the lash and lid you want to create, I think about 6 to 7. 8 would probably be the highest, the thickest I would do. So here she's putting a hard limit on the poles. 10 millimeters, that's Caucasian. Asian, very natural, that's 6 millimeters, right? So those are the two poles. There's Asian and there's Caucasian. But then the 7, 6 to 7, and 8 indicates she's not sure what to call the in-between. It's less obvious what could be the case there. But she also says, Asian is very natural. That implies that it's sort of a less obvious kind of procedure. It's something that might be more desirable for patients. And she calls Caucasian a little odd, a little different. So she's sort of subtly discouraging patients from doing it. So Dr. Huang is attempting some quantitative standardization here with numbers, right? And saying this is one side, that's the other. But she kind of falters with the in-between part. This may sound like a minuscule distinction, right? We're talking about 3 millimeters, but it would be apparent to the naked eye from across the room. It ends up having a pretty big effect. So calling the Asian look natural, it's clear which one she prefers, but less clear ultimately where she would draw the line. So cosmetic surgeons in Malaysia, as this is an example of, do offer a Caucasian or Western aesthetic to patients who seek it, but they prefer to give patients a look in line with the Asian aesthetic. And they're two nominally distinct standards, but what to give a specific patient who comes into you to see you is a matter of clinical judgment based on the particular patient's face. So I've talked a lot about surgeons, but patients were also part of this picture too. Patients came in asking for specific things, and they used similar kinds of terms. So this Malaysian Chinese female patient, I'll call her Andrea, was in her mid-30s, and she told me, I'd still like to maintain Oriental features. So I told the surgeon that I prefer to have a low crease. I would like something more natural. So she's using the same kind of language we saw previously, and in consultations, I observed that Malaysian surgeons move patients' eyelids with a metal tool as the patient watched in the mirror, so that they could come to an agreement about what natural meant or what Asian meant without necessarily having to go through this quantitative standardization. Surgeons went and patients went back and forth in this visual medium. But ultimately, the surgeon decided whether the ideal requested was one he or she was willing to realize. This is a surgeon, or a patient can't just walk in, tell the surgeon, hey, I want this, I'm gonna get this, hand me your scalpel, I've got it, right? You need some sort of buy-in in order to go from there. So Malaysian cosmetic surgeons did not receive distinct training in aesthetics as part of their overall cosmetic surgery training. And that's true for all plastic surgeons. They all learn on burn victims and people who've had horrific injuries in car accidents for 5 or 10 years after medical school. That's what residency is. But then they do a year of fellowship and they sort of rely on their artistic sense. Many of them do sculpting or sculpture or painting or other kinds of art to develop what they think is a sense of aesthetics or beauty. And so their clinical judgment is comprised of ideas circulating in their broader cultural milieu, which would depend on where they're practicing. So Dr. Huang explained in more detail this Chinese face reading philosophy called Mian as informing what she might give patients. So in consultation with a middle-aged Chinese patient, I watched her Google the term Yanxiang and navigate to a page featuring a face reading map like this one. Each number corresponded to a meaning. So concerned about her temples, 10 and 1, they looked to see what the map said that temples meant, and found it said that it indicated poor relations with one's husband. The woman's husband was sitting in the corner of the room, and so he sort of raises an eyebrow saying, well, I'm here, right? So the patient said, I want to eliminate these dents, what can you do for me? And together they came up with a plan to put fillers in to remedy the problem. That increases the appearance of fullness. So ideals and looks that seem to fit within conventional Western or Caucasian ideals, especially a larger eyelid, could be arrived at other historical and regionally specific means, including Mianxiang, this sort of face reading practice. And that itself, this is hundreds of years old, took on a new life and relevance in cosmetic surgery. This young plastic surgeon is Googling this and keeping this map up in her office. So face reading philosophies, as a sort of side note, are based on the notion that the face is the window to the character of the soul, and that looking at the face gives you some accurate portrayal of the personality of the person you're looking at. So what cosmetic surgery allows people to do is to modify that first impression, that sort of superficial take, and to reproject oneself to the world, to change one's outward self to match what you think the inner self should be. All right, so the one other thing I want to say about Malaysia was the role of religion for Malaysian surgeons. So we saw at the conference level, when they talked about Asian, it was in these very broad strokes and opposed to Latin or to Western. But in the Malaysian context, they had to think about differences within the Asian category. And the difference that really stuck out was for Muslim Malay patients. In 2006, the State Council of Religion in Malaysia declared a fatwa or a ban on Botox, saying that it was forbidden and people couldn't use it. And so there was all of a sudden this sort of panic about, well, can we do any plastic surgery? What is acceptable? How do we draw the line? And who decides? So surgeons said, okay, we don't want to get in trouble. We don't want to go to jail. So any Muslim patient who's coming to seek cosmetic surgery must first seek approval from an imam, who was a spiritual advisor in Islam. And so patients dutifully went and spoke with their imams, and imams were fine with it in most cases. The particular scandal the ban came about because the production process of Botox included an enzyme from a pig, which they interpreted as not halal. So the way the Malaysian State Council resolved this is said, okay, if there's no pig components in any part of surgery, and this is more common than you might expect, then it is halal, and it should be fine if patients want to proceed. So some Malaysian cosmetic surgeons saw this as a business opportunity. They paid very close attention to the production processes and the specific ingredients of the injectables and fillers that they put into patients, as well as to the implants, the kinds of carving of silicone and nose things that I showed you earlier. Dr. Christine, a middle-aged Chinese middle-aged Indian aesthetic physician with a practice located in a well-to-do part of Kuala Lumpur, started a line of halal skincare products and fillers, which you can see depicted here. Halal certification reassured patients. It came from the government and had a set of strictures that went along with it. And so it not only reassured Muslim patients by saying this is not going to fall afoul of religious restrictions, but she said it also made cosmetics safer and more appealing to strict Hindu and Buddhist vegetarians or others with religious restrictions. She even cited Christians and Confucians as feeling more comfortable with a homegrown approach to aesthetics. So Malaysian cosmetic surgeons employ both a mix of physical and cultural explanations for pan-ethnic Asian similarity, as well as within Asian difference across the categories that were relevant there. Their clinical judgment brought a different cultural common sense to conceptualizing the racial category Asian and treating Asian patients. The opposite of Asian was not necessarily Caucasian, but could also be Indian. Cosmetic surgeons in Malaysia recognized considerable variation in the category Asian and incorporated special considerations on the basis of Confucian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim sensibilities. So to return to the questions that I began with, how and why are surgeons using race in this practice, and specifically the category Asian? So across sites and scales, they're using the category Asian, but to refer to slightly different features, ideals, and techniques. It really matters what that other comparative element is, right? They enhance their reach by not fully standardizing Asian. They're not saying, check all these boxes and Asian applies. They're just using the label in specific conversations with different reference at any given point in time. And so that means that that a Malaysian doctor can appeal to someone in Australia or in India or in Malaysia, using this sort of expansive category. And developing the expertise in that way, saying they have an expertise on Asian cosmetic surgery, allows surgeons to assert their unique clinical judgment and appeal to more potential patients. Asian is a label that patients recognize and identify with in different kinds of contexts. They might have more specific labels they also identify with, but it's something that gets people's attention, and it's a way of differentiating themselves in a competitive market. So ultimately, this fuzziness, this ambiguity with a category of Asian is useful for plastic surgeons. They don't want to get too specific. And the use of their categories makes them seem to have a broader field of expertise beyond the particular country that they might be living in. So this is a story in part about patients and surgeons being willing to travel. I'm going to leave it at that, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Alka. I'm going to invite Dr. Alison Dell to introduce the second speaker for today. Dr. Dell is a member of the biology department as well as the interdisciplinary studies department. She's also the co-director of the initiative to internationalize the curriculum.
Alka, thank you so much for that illuminating talk. It's given me so much to think about. It's my honor to show you guys how badly I speak French. I'm delighted to introduce Gaëtan Thomas. He is a lecturer at Sciences Po Paris and a member of the Centre de Recherche Historique at the École des Hautes Études des Sciences Sociales in Paris, where he received his doctorate just recently in 2018. His dissertation focused on the epidemiology of infectious diseases, particularly looking at how we adopted standards of vaccination by making them routine in physician practice. He, in addition to his prize-winning dissertation, Dr. Thomas was the recipient of a Fulbright, which he served at the Menon School of Public Health at Columbia University. I'm very much looking forward to his talk.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Karen, for the invitation. Thank you, the department, and thank you all of you for coming. Can you hear me? I hope I'm not going to lose you with my accent. I apologize in advance. So, I work in the field of the history of medicine and the history of quantification of numbers, and I'm going to present to you something about the history of immunization that I've been working on during my Ph.D. So, let's start. Western experts have publicly described immunization as a health intervention in crisis, strengthened by public mistrust. Countless articles report sudden small epidemics of diseases that were thought to have been controlled by immunization. Even though the hazards of vaccination have been sharply reduced in the last decade, the skepticism around this intervention is said to be partly related to a lack of confidence in its inappropriately alleged long-term effects. Officials emphasize the perceived risk of immunization, and several books, you might be aware of that, have been written from the point of view of well-educated mothers facing the prospect of vaccinating their children. They have been published in the recent years, consolidating a framework of analysis structured primarily around risk. Of course, there are other registers of analysis, including the issue of religious beliefs. While these explanations enjoy great popularity among public health experts, journalists, and the general public, they are problematic for a number of reasons. They tend to exaggerate the scope of the crisis. Immunization might be discussed on the internet and contested within religious communities and amongst skeptics. However, it remains one of the most common and successful health interventions globally. We need to keep in mind that the issue of resistance, of avoidance, of hesitancy to immunization is often framed by public health experts who overstate, for strategic reasons or unconsciously, its gravity. Public health, as articulated by the anthropologist Didier Fassin, remains a meditation on failure. So what does Fassin mean when he says public health is a meditation on failure? He mostly refers to two things. First, in public health, there is very often a wide gap between the intentions, between the goals and the actual achievements. And it leads to a kind of like melancholy among experts. We can never reach like the eradication of it. Only one disease was eradicated in the history of public health. So there is this idea that public health is a very ambitious discipline and body of practices and discourses, but it lacks the support of the politicians. It lacks the support of like the public. It's partly related to the fact that public health is a discipline and a body of practices that lacks legitimacy in academia and institutionally also. So there's, the idea of failure is very common in public health. So when you look at all those discourses about like immunization being in crisis, think that, okay, it might face some criticism, but there is also the structuring discourse about failure in public health that is very important. And one of the problems around this meditation on failure is that it rarely addresses the actual functioning of health systems and institutions, or even the changing nature of health interventions. Failure is blamed on individuals, so-called failings, on their irrational decisions and fears, their over-anxious parents, their orthodox observer. So what would a meditation on failure look like if we shift the focus away from patients' behaviors towards the changing nature of the immunization device? I argue that the economization and the commodification of immunization, I will define those words later, were important transformations in the last quarter of the 20th century that bolstered the instances of controversy around immunization. A close examination of these processes might shed new light on the crisis, the so-called crisis of confidence, on what has long been framed as a cheap and altruistic intervention. So I will proceed in three related ways. I start by examining an important step in the history of economization of health, namely the expanded program on immunization, or EPI, launched by the World Health Organization in 1974, in linking the operation of vaccination to the logic of cost calculations. The EPI oriented actors nationally in different countries to the notion of cost well before the pharmaceutical industry benefited from the enormous market created by the program. This preceded a major turn, the introduction of an unusually expensive vaccine, the vaccine against hepatitis B, in the early 80s, and the subsequent rise in most vaccines prices during the 1980s. In the final section of the presentation, I focus on a major vaccine controversy in France, actually the first controversy in the history of in the second part of the 20th century in France related to vaccine. That was also a controversy around this very expensive vaccine, the vaccine around against hepatitis B. And I do argue that this crisis might be the first crisis of immunization as a commodity. So let's start with the idea of vaccine being a very cheap intervention, immunization being a very cheap intervention. In the 1970s, vaccines were considered one of the cheapest interventions in the realm of medicine. Lewis Thomas, a public figure in American biomedicine, referred to them in 1971 as, I'm quoting, relatively inexpensive, relatively simple, and relatively easy to deliver. So it was in this text like distinguishing different kind of medical intervention, and vaccine like antibiotics were considered the most efficient and the cheapest intervention in the realm of medicine. The reasons for which vaccines were so cheap are fairly straightforward. Their cost of production was extremely low, and for decades they were produced not only by pharmaceutical companies, but also by public institutes. Vaccine innovations were often considered public goods. You might be aware that Jonas Salk, who created the polio vaccine, one of the most successful pharmaceuticals of the post-war period, refused to patent his invention. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? He famously declared in 1952. This low cost was an important justification for large-scale immunization programs, as in the case of a campaign launched in 1977 in the United States, the Carter's Childhood Immunization Initiative. It was announced 3 months after the new president took office. As the nation reminds us, like the American historian Elena Conis, struggling economy, oil crisis, and rising healthcare costs made frequent headlines. In the explicit interest of saving healthcare's dollars, the program urged states to enforce childhood vaccination. The idea was that immunization was very cheap, was the main rationale of this national program. What I refer to an economization of immunization goes beyond the simple justification of immunization because of its low cost and price. Economization names the practices assigning an economic value to an intervention. These practices, so most of the time they're like scientific practices, they're protocol, they're standardized, you have to follow a guideline. So these practices might be carried out by economists, public health experts, epidemiologists, or even program managers at a local level. One of the best case studies for looking at the economization of vaccines is the expanded program on immunization, the EPI, launched by the World Health Organization, as I said, in 1974. It was the first initiative to implement immunization globally and systematically. So I don't know if you've heard about this program, but you've probably heard about a program that happened before, which was the smallpox eradication campaign that led to the eradication of the disease in the late 1970s. And the origin of the EPI lies in this program, in this eradication program. But differently from the smallpox campaign, the EPI did not originally aim for the eradication of any particular disease. This program was meant to include 6 vaccines against pertussis, diphtheria, poliomyelitis, measles, tetanus, and tuberculosis, and to strengthen the weak immunization policies in developing countries. The goal was to reach high worldwide vaccine coverage, maintained through a continuous and ongoing effort. In other words, the EPI would have no denouement. So the EPI's beginnings in the mid-1970s were quite sluggish, as the increasing interest in alternative and affordable public health, defined by the 1978 conference of Alka, seriously threatened the existence of a program reminiscent of the controversial vertical intervention. So in the language of public health, vertical intervention refers to this campaign that target usually one disease using one kind of technology, either a very toxic chemical or a vaccine, and that aims to eradicate disease. And it was violently criticized in the 1970s because it had no impact on the broader structure of healthcare in the countries where those campaigns were carried out. Obviously, this global new vaccine campaign was pretty much like that kind of vertical intervention, because it would have no impact. Officials would not build hospitals for carrying out vaccinations. They would just ask the population to come and to get vaccinated. It wouldn't change anything structurally. So the Alma conference, organized by the WHO, marked a turning point in the history of international public health. Representatives from all over the world participated in the staging of a vision of public health that challenged 2 decades of post-war campaigns and reflected the emergence of countermodels, especially from China and India. These experiences underscore the urgency of, I'm quoting, a primary healthcare perspective that included the training of community health workers and the resolution of basic economic and environmental problems. So did vaccination have a place in this new doctrine? As a preventive measure, vaccination met the requirements of health for all. However, the proximity between the EPI, as I said, and the smallpox eradication campaign, and the obvious vertical dimension of any vaccination campaign made it difficult to associate the EPI with this newly adopted vision. So at first, that's very interesting when you look at the archives of the WHO, because you can really see how a team of people, a very small team of people, tried to answer an institutional problem. They were lacking legitimacy inside the institution, so they asked themselves, how are we going to literally save a program? And they saved their program using a cost calculation, cost-benefit calculations, because it was cost-benefit calculation were always favorable to immunization. Every vaccine, when it was examined through the lens of cost-benefit operation, was said to be cost-benefit. So even though there was a strong link, between the EPI and a controversial program, because vaccination at this time was so cheap and was also cost-benefit, it could still fit the ideological framework of the primary health care. So in the late 1970s, the EPI began to take an interest in the economic appraisal of the national programs it was implementing. They linked their activities with cost-benefit studies whose results were systematically favorable to immunization. So the cost-benefit, what is it? It's an appraisal This is an accounting approach to assessment. It consists of a simple comparison between inputs and outputs, between cost and results. It can be applied to an immunization campaign, to a vaccine, to an institution, and even to a team of people. Without having to challenge the vertical dimension of the EBI, this operation allowed it to adapt in an oblique way to the ideological framework of primary health care. So the cost-benefit calculation provided a solution to a set of political problems faced by the EPI inside the WHO. So many studies have been I'm sorry it's not appearing properly, but it was supposed to be 3 different titles of articles. So guidelines were circulated to inside governments to produce cost-benefit assessments. And whether or not the studies were comparable, and even if they failed to follow the WHO guidelines, they regularly asserted that immunization was unrivaled from the point of view of cost. WHO even created a software in the late 80s. It was called EPI Cost, intended to produce data on the cost of the EPI. The WHO also multiplied the estimates of the raw cost to fully immunize a child. In the 1970s, EPI officials argued that only $3 were necessary for fully immunizing a child against the 6 EPI diseases. This estimate became $5 in the early 1980s, and then between $5 and $15, and finally $13 in 1993. Despite the dramatic increase, the numbers kept alive the attractive nature of immunization. All these studies on statistics, so I'm not I won't give you more details on this operation, but that was a major branch of the program to assess economically the intervention at every level, at the global level, in the headquarters, at the local level, at the regional level. Every manager had to assess economically his or her program. For the first time in many countries outside the United States, immunization was strongly characterized through a managerial and financial approach. In the 80s, there was an avalanche of numbers on the cost of immunization, and these numbers were obviously very good for immunization because they were supposed to be good. They were supposed to justify the campaign. But at the same time, in the early 1980s, a specific vaccine inaugurated a new era in the industry, characterized by high prices, an unprecedented number of patents, and aggressive commercial competition. The hepatitis B vaccine got marketing authorization in 1981 in the United States and other countries, including France. And as explained by several historians, the price of the new vaccine came as a shock to public health campaigners. Most vaccines sold at under $2 per immunization at this time, a price the World Health Organization considered affordable. By contrast, this vaccine, the hepatitis B vaccine, was marketed in the US at around $90 to $100 in 1991 for an immunizing course of 3 doses, making it by far the most expensive vaccine produced until then, and placing it well beyond the reach of the vast majority of people at risk from the disease. The company which produces the vaccine in the United States, Merck, defended the price on the ground that the vaccine could not be produced for less. But nevertheless, we know very well that Merck's pricing policy was also consistent with a targeted approach to marketing aimed at well-to-do consumers in wealthy countries. So even though a new generation of hepatitis B vaccine entered the market in the mid-1980s, and although they were considered easier and cheaper to produce, the level of prices remained largely unaffected. This vaccine, I'm quoting an historian, conformed more closely to a pharmaceutical system increasingly characterized by the use of intellectual property to maximize profits than to an older, predominantly public health-oriented system of vaccine development and distribution. And very interestingly, this phenomenon was not limited to the vaccine against hepatitis B. The price of most vaccines rose in the 1980s. Data provided by the CDC demonstrate that the price of a common pediatric vaccine, for instance, the DTP, jumped almost 3,000% between 1977 and 1999. By the end of the 80s, the sun had been patented, so to speak, referring back to Salk's ironic utterance, and immunization was no longer a cheap intervention. So this major shift in the nature of immunization, which lost its status as the cheapest intervention, this shift did it have an effect on the perception of immunization. So I'm going to I argue that it did, and I will demonstrate that with a case study on the hepatitis B crisis in France. So the hepatitis B vaccine controversy that erupted in 1996 seemed to be an entirely French phenomenon. This dispute lasted several years, fueled by allegations that the vaccine caused a range of diseases, including multiple sclerosis, leading to the shutdown of a national campaign and various trials. Oddly, the controversy remained limited to France, where no major vaccine controversy had been documented since the interwar period. In this respect, the episode was doubly unique. It had neither points of comparison for the same vaccine in other countries, nor recent national precedents. So this controversy has attracted a lot of commentaries because it was so new in the field of immunization. Nonetheless, it has been scarcely noted that the WHO was a major target of this national controversy, of the protest, and an important actor in the discussion. Before the controversy, the growing influence of this international body in matters of immunization worldwide has been taken up by the main French organization opposing vaccines. So 5 years, like 6, 7 years, or 5 years, depending on the publication, before the controversy erupted, you could see in the publication of these groups opposing vaccination a very sustained coverage of this international program, which was quite surprising, in a national publication. Like the EPI that I described in the beginning of my talk was not exactly covered by the mainstream media, but it was very well covered by this small publication of people opposing immunization. The EPI was repeatedly featured in the magazine. You could read sentences like, donating to an organization supporting children's vaccination is not an innocent gesture, even if their card is rather cute. They criticized the fact that beyond the uncontroversial imagery associated with UN initiatives, there lay a strategy to impose Western technologies on third world medical traditions. While the EPI was framed as a neocolonial project in many articles, which is coming from a French group quite ironic given the history of France and the enduring relationship between France and Africa in the 1980s, it was also strongly related to the French context. In 1990, for instance, a French measles, mumps, rubella campaign was wrongly described as being part of this international program. But most criticism related to France did not question public health sovereignty. It raised economic issues. The EPI was accused of creating a global market favoring the powerful French vaccine industry. This was a new register of objections raised by the opponents to vaccination, who had until the mid-1980s remained focused on legal obligation and vaccine hazards. This characterization of the EPI was not immune to error, but it gave rise to a set of arguments that re-emerged a few years later in the controversy. Questions around the safety of the hepatitis B vaccine appeared in the media in 1995, 1 year after the launch of a national campaign to vaccinate adolescents in public schools. As concern about the side effects grew dramatically, Geneva, so the headquarters of the WHO, reacted publicly in 1997, dismissing the French media coverage of the alleged side effects and warning against the potential damages to important public health programs, I'm quoting. The WHO intervention in the French controversy immediately backlashed. The most active publication in the controversy, the independent health magazine Alternative Santé, titled a short article, "The World Health Organization is at the service of the vaccine merchants." As the controversy unfolded over the years, the organization became a political target. The UN agency was labeled the World Immunization Organization, while global immunization campaigns were accused wholesale of enriching vaccine producers. From this perspective, we should describe the hepatitis B controversy as one of the first major crises of immunization as a commodity. So why was a line of attack linking the WHO to pharmaceutical greed so efficient in the second half of the 1990s? During this period, the WHO effectively narrowed ties with the industry through the promotion of public-private partnerships. However, these collaborations, emblematic of the rise of neoliberal global health, did not receive mention in the discourse on the controversy. It was rather a form of economization that laid the ground for such a broad economic attack. Many articles published in the French press, as well as letters sent by the parents to the government, referred to the unusually high price of the product, alleging that the states, because the vaccine was reimbursed, was favoring vaccine producers. The fact that the pharmaceutical industry aggressively communicated about the vaccine in the mid-1990s further triggered suspicion. The political emphasis on cost, initiated by the EPI in the late 1970s, proved fatal in this rapidly changing landscape. The metrics of global health provided a precarious solution. The hepatitis B was certainly very expensive. The hepatitis B vaccine was certainly very expensive, but it was said to be still on the right side of cost-benefit calculations. However, the hepatitis B vaccine was not always cost-beneficial. While it was the first vaccine to be narrowly examined through the lens of cost-benefit calculation in France, public health officials struggled to decide whether its cost actually outweighed its benefits. And quite interestingly, I don't know if I have a slide. Quite interestingly, cost-benefit calculations were publicly discussed, which is a very specialized topic, and mocked during the controversy. The crisis of evidence then, because we used to look at this controversy as a crisis of causal evidence between the vaccine and the alleged side effect, the alleged disease, the crisis of evidence was not limited to the causal, as multiple sclerosis and the vaccine. It also involved economic data. So shifting the focus from, as a conclusion, very brief conclusion, shifting the focus from side effects to the question of prices helps answer the question of why this controversy was limited to France. The national pharmaceutical industry was experiencing major capitalist consolidation in the 1980s and 1990s. As the Merieux Institute, the main French vaccine producer, absorbed Pasteur production and the Canadian Connell Laboratory, achieving the status of a global leader in vaccines. This paralleled the privatization of vaccine production worldwide, fully transforming vaccines into commodities. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaëtan. Our speakers would be happy to take some questions. Dr. Dell, will you monitor the questioning? We have some mics in case you need them. Questions, please.
I have two questions for our young man that spoke about vaccinations. I was wondering if your research included any religious groups' objectives to vaccinations, because I have seen that a little bit. And then also you mentioned that in France, they considered multiple sclerosis as a side effect, right? I know there was a big thing in this country that I think it's been proven false or something, it's been rejected anyways, that autism, a lot of parents were thinking that since there's a rise in autism in this country, could be the diagnosis of it. But I was just wondering if you'd seen that in your studies at all.
Answer right?
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I don't think it's working.
Maybe this one. Yeah, this one.
So yeah, so the like, this one will be.
Yeah.
So no, this is a very, thank you, this is a very, I mean, this is a highly discussed subject, the question of the link between the hepatitis B vaccine and multiple sclerosis. And it was actually a state crisis because in France there is a commission, a national commission for the immunization, obviously immunization in English, like, you know, of the people, the victims of the vaccines. So they will get like a pension. And it's been active since, actually it's been created before in the United States you have such commission also. It's been created in the mid-1980s. In France it was created in the late 70s. And the first one was created in Germany in the 60s. So this commission had to establish if there is a causal link between the vaccine and the disease. And the problem is that, you know, for decades, for 2 decades and a half, like this commission, they were having like 2 meetings a year, like dealing with like 5 cases. It was very inactive. And suddenly when the hepatitis B campaign started, they were overwhelmed with the number of requests. There were like hundreds and hundreds of people filing like requests to get like to get a pension because they were supposedly sick. And the commission, the role of the commission, you know, it's a very interesting case here obviously because it's a body that speaks on the behalf of the state, but it uses like scientific evidence, and in order to like to recognize that a person is really a victim of a vaccine, they has to establish a link between the disease and the vaccine. And for years they didn't answer those requests because they didn't know there was a link between multiple sclerosis and these vaccines. And at the time in 2000, after like several expert meetings happened, they decided that there was one. But the state didn't recognize that. So the commission inside the state did agree to reimburse people while, you know, the state didn't publicly acknowledge that they could, the existence of a link. And the problem is that after this event, like many people have been reimbursed and they still receive pension, the state denied that there is a link. And most epidemiologists nowadays deny that there is a link. So a few people are still like, you know, a few people who have an actual disease, which is multiple sclerosis, receive a pension from the state since that time. But epidemiologists, state of public health officials, virologists, they all deny that there is a link, a direct causal link between the vaccine and multiple sclerosis. Nevertheless, they do accept the idea that the vaccine could trigger the disease in a certain group of people who were prone to get the disease. It could increase the risk to develop the disease if you get vaccinated, but it's not a causal link. So this is not the official position of the state and of most experts. And the autism thing is fully denied by everyone except, like a few anti-vaccine people. But there is no study on nothing that, and it's not even taken seriously like by those commissions. You know, they will examine people who have like multiple sclerosis or another kind of neurological disease that could be like related to immunization, because it's been demonstrated in the literature that there might be a link between a certain kind of neurological diseases and vaccination, but autism is totally out of the question in the realm of like those experts and the states.
I have a question for Professor Menon. That was really fascinating, and I was thinking, would you say, if you think about the history of cosmetic surgery, it kind of seems like there's almost like this trifurcation. Initially, it was this thing in the West for, helping people look more white. Particularly, the first time I learned about it was Jews in the United States wanting to have nose jobs. I think now they're called something else, but. And then it became more about sexual desirability, like breast implants. And now with like the advent of Botox, it's about looking younger. And I'm just wondering, is this trajectory related to like economic development or something else, like just the development and availability of all these new things like Botox that didn't exist really 10, 15 years ago?
That's a really great question. So there definitely has been an increase in accessibility to cosmetic procedures and the decrease in price of them, and that's related both to the kinds of interventions that are available. They became less expensive over time. Botox and fillers are way cheaper than anything involving surgery and anesthesia, and so you could call it democratization in terms of it being more available to a greater number of people, and so that you see, in addition to variation of goals on the basis of gender and on race, of class, that's also an element that's going through the different kinds of goals that you mentioned. So it's not that the goals got replaced, is I guess what I would say, that people still are doing procedures to get rid of racial markers or to enhance sexuality, but who's doing that might change over time, and who can afford the procedures, because there were some changes in technology, as well as increasing expansion of medical credit, which made it possible for middle class and working class people also to go for this. So it's not just at the elites. That's one thing that's changed in the last 30, 40 years.
It looks like there's a question in the middle towards the back.
The question is age a big deal there, because I know that's something that's happening here in the United States on what age is safe or not safe.
Yeah. Well, do you mean like in terms of the high end or the low end?
No, like now teenagers want, cosmetic surgery, and maybe that's too young to have it. What's the feel over in Malaysia?
Yeah, so this
age
is
appropriate.
Right. No, this is actually a debate. That's a good question. So most surgeons are reluctant in Malaysia to operate on patients who are under 10 or 12 for certain things. Some parents will come in and say, hey, my kid has this, surgeons are most interested in whether patients are going to continue to grow. So with a nose, you would never operate on a nose before the age of 10 because it's still too little, and who knows what will happen as they get older. But for other kinds of things, for instance, if the kid has a big birthmark or a mole and the parent wants to remove that, most surgeons would sort of say, hey, let's wait till the kid can sort of argue their case on this. And the line, where they draw that line varies, but it tends to be teenagers closer to age 16. Most surgeons are the most comfortable operating on patients after they've hit the age of majority, legal majority, in whatever the society is. So in the US, it's 18, and in fact, for breast implants, interestingly, you cannot get silicone breast implants until you're 21. You can only get saline breast implants before that. So there is this sort of differentiation of age about what kinds of risks you can take on. And one line of argument is it's based on growth in the body, and the other argument is, can you take on those risks for yourself? Can you make that kind of calculation? So surgeons are much more uncomfortable operating on youths than for very old patients, 80-year-olds who want facelifts. They're much more comfortable focusing on the health of the patient than they're less certain about the youth.
Other questions?
Yes. I have a question concerning vaccines. And I heard you speaking about the commercialization of vaccine in and of itself and how it sort of exploded in the 90s, I think that's what you said, right? But it's really interesting to note if a vaccine is given to individual A versus individual B, C, D, E. Will the vaccine still have the same efficacious activity within that individual or those individuals? That's number one, right? And maybe the point that I'm driving at is the question, could vaccines have adverse effects? That's my question.
Everyone in the scientific community acknowledges that there are side effects. Like any pharmaceutical has side effects. But they are less and less serious regarding immunization. That's why all this discourse on the vaccines crisis is blamed on the people, because it's argued that vaccines are not so safe. In the 1970s, the vaccine against smallpox was extremely visible internationally because it was at the center of a global campaign. But that was also quite a dangerous, not dangerous, but the hazards of the vaccine against smallpox were very high, and many people got very serious side effects. That doesn't happen anymore. So there are side effects for sure. That's why there are those commissions nationally who are supposed to give pension to people who get some diseases in relationship to the immunization. But yeah, there are side effects, but they're very rare. But everyone acknowledges that there are side effects.
Rubric. So I'm writing my thesis paper on body dysmorphia, and I was curious about the preemptive measures that plastic surgeons take before operating on a patient.
That's a really great question. So something I didn't get much of a chance to talk about is the sort of division within the field of plastic surgery. So there's this general field of plastic surgery. Sometimes that was the category that I use. And then within that field, there's a differentiation between reconstructive plastic surgeons who focus on treating congenital deformities at birth, or repairing noses after accidents, things like that, or burns. That's a big area. And then cosmetics focus on the sort of taking a healthy patient and improving some aspect of the appearance. And for patients seeking gender confirmation surgeries, they have been taken up by the reconstructive side and not the cosmetic side. So most of the people I talk to would say I would refer someone who I thought had body dysmorphia. I wouldn't treat them, and I would put them on this other side, where the procedures are a little bit different for deciding what the goal is and whether to operate. They're often work hand in hand with multidisciplinary teams. But what's really interesting is that on the cosmetic side, they know about body dysmorphia. It's something that they worry about. They don't want to operate on a patient who they think won't ever be satisfied or happy because of some underlying psychological distress. But they don't screen in any systematic way. They don't give patients even a questionnaire. They sit and have an initial conversation that might be 30 minutes or an hour. They ask about the reasons for surgery. They ascertain whether the motives are realistic or not. And so the reconstructive side is trying to get the cosmetic side to use some of the tools and the interdisciplinary crossover to say, hey, then we're all going to be better off if this is in use. And in other countries, so in Malaysia and in the US, they don't use any systematic screening for body dysmorphia. But in other countries, this is more part of the process. In Denmark and Europe in general, they do have these kinds of things.
Hi, my name is Amir. So I just wanted to know a little bit about the Islamic ban in Malaysia. You said that Botox and some of the plastic surgery materials are banned. Is that affected only by the public or private practice? Is private practice affected by that? And like people traveling from different countries to get Botox or plastic surgery, does the authorities have anything to do over that, or just like for Malaysian Muslims?
So that's a good question. So the fatwa or ban, it was, how much of a legal ban is it? It didn't have it was not the highest level of legal authority saying, you know, this is dangerous, don't do it, or this is firmly illegal. It was more of an advisory saying this is not so good. So, for example, Malaysia sells plenty of food that's not halal, but they will designate what is halal very prominently, even on like the food carts at all on the street. So it's it's a designation with consequences because people didn't want to be the target of controversy. They didn't want to sort of create a social media storm, being known as the person going against the sort of ban and not being sensitive. But it did apply to private and public doctors, and most cosmetic surgeons are in private practice, and surgeons were worried that it would affect the medical tourist market. They are trying to attract a medical tourist market from the Middle East for patients who they think that this sort of the concerns about pork products being in the materials would be real for them too. So there was this kind of balance between not scaring away patients from abroad and maintaining availability of this for patients from China who are not Muslim, for example, and attracting more people from the Middle East. So it became a kind of hospital level thing. You know, they would ask you questions, they'd figure out, okay, this isn't a concern for you. At the expat hospital, you could get this. But they moved away from Botox into its competitor, Dysport, at the international level to just say, yeah, you can still have a neuromodulator, but this one's all synthetic, so we're just, you know, not going to deal with it.
So in Malaysia, what type of surgical intervention is most popular?
Yeah, so the most popular ones are actually liposuction, which is removal of fat from different parts of the body. In some cases, you remove the fat from one place and put it in another to create a certain kind of figure. But in Malaysia, in contrast to the US, breast augmentation is a lot less popular. In fact, the first thing a doctor said to me on my first interview was, Malaysia is not a boob society. You know, just take that out of your head, that's an American thing. And so Malaysian doctors talked about trying to create a small profile. So breast reduction was considered to be a cosmetic procedure in Malaysia because the idea is that was more in line with the overall ideal of beauty. And so liposuction was up there. Eyelid surgeries were very common. Nasal surgeries were very common, and the Botox and fillers, the sort of nips and tweaks on the face, were common for men and women actually, to a greater extent than in the US.
Well, cosmetic surgeries are like really trendy at present, and definitely many people who decide to perform those surgeries, they have some identity issues, and for many people, they're desperate for that. And I can understand why people would want to do that. Actually, as a matter of fact, I had one student who tried to convince us that his life improved and became much better after he performed the surgery, although he didn't clarify what surgery or specifically he did, and we couldn't guess. So, but not all surgeries are successful. As a matter of fact, some of them are real disaster. Is there any, first of all, how do doctors protect themselves? And is there, like, does it end in a lawsuit, like in the United States? And is there any research on those people who underwent the surgery, but the outcome turned out to be the opposite from what was intended and expected?
Yeah. So plastic surgery in the United States is the medical discipline with the second highest medical liability malpractice rates after gynecology, because gynecology and obstetrics, there's inevitably some complications with some births at the population level, but everybody wants a perfect birth, right? That's the outcome that's the most desirable. Cosmetic surgery is like that. Everybody wants to look exactly the way they want it to look after the surgery, but the body doesn't always cooperate. The surgeon may not be up to par. There's all sorts of reasons why things can go wrong. So this, the screening process for cosmetic surgeons is very important. They do refuse patients right off the bat. They say, I won't operate if they think that the patient cannot be satisfied. So there's not a standardized way that they do this screening. This is what's kind of interesting about the body dysmorphia. But they're looking for what they call red flags, that patients point to different features in explaining what's wrong, that they can't that they can't articulate a clear feature, physical feature. That's often the basis for thinking, let's pause. Some surgeons will monitor people. They'll say, well, let's build up a relationship. I'll tell you if it's aging related. It's like, I'll tell you. You don't need a facelift now. You look great. I'll tell you. Come back every year. I'll give you Botox in the meantime, but we'll work up to it. So they try to manage it in less invasive ways to avoid this sort of outcome. But the sort of, I don't know that there's very many systematic follow-ups with patients who do have complications and are unhappy. Surgeons typically offer revision surgeries in those cases for reduced rates, sometimes even free. They present it at conferences, but it's surgeons presenting their own mistakes, so it has to be taken with a grain of salt. And nobody presents the cases where a patient passes away, right, which is the ultimate in complications. So there's sort of a bias towards fixable complications that would get studied by them. So it would be interesting to think more systematically about those.
I imagine that might be a real issue when ambiguity is preserved by doctors who, that might increase a mismatch in expectation between doctor and patient.
Yeah, it's one that they try to get around with images, which isn't something I didn't get to talk about, but they do documentation. They'll take a picture before, they'll take a picture after, they'll run it through Photoshop, and they'll say, look, we saw the same thing. We're not just talking, we saw the same thing, and yeah, you're right, this nose is crooked at the end. Then they'll do the revision. Otherwise they'll say, well, your nose was always crooked, and now it's not any worse, so that's on you.
My question is for Menon. So I wanted to ask, here in the United States, body sculpting is extremely popular to achieve the Latina look, maybe a little more curvy. Do you see that in Asia? Is that something that they're doing, or maybe are they looking for another body type?
Yeah, so they're using liposuction for similar kinds of sculpting, but the look is different. It's not a curvy or full figured look. It's often streamlined, tiny figures. Like the goal is to get, it's not even the hourglass waist idea. You just want a trim profile altogether. And so it's, what I've been tracking is actually whether buttocks lifts or butt augmentations are taking off in Asia. They were not there, 5 or 6 years ago, but this moves very quickly. And so surgeons were telling me from Malaysia that they'd come to the US or to Brazil to get trained in doing those kinds of changing figure looks. So they do, and there were billboards for the Kardashians all over Kuala Lumpur. So it's not that these images are not there, it's not necessarily what people have gone for up to the time.
Good. Is there a pressing question? Okay.
I'd like to thank both our speakers today for such an interesting conversation and very interesting presentation. Thank you all for coming, and we have some refreshments outside, and you can talk to speakers informally for a bit if you want. Thank you.